Okay, let's unpack this. April 22nd, 2025, that militant attack near Pahalgam, 28 tourists killed, 17 injured. It's just a chilling headline.
Really awful.
Yeah, the worst civilian loss in Kashmir since 2019. And the resistance front, linked to Lashkar-e-Taiba, they claimed responsibility.
And the reaction was immediate, wasn't it? PM Modi cutting short his Saudi trip.
Right, and Home Minister Shah heading straight to Srinagar for security review.
But what's fascinating here, or maybe important is the better word, is that while we react to this horrible event, it's really vital to see it's not isolated.
Exactly. It's part of something much bigger, much longer.
It's a stark reminder of this long, deeply rooted conflict. So today, using the material you've shared, we're really going to dive into the significant economic costs and maybe even more profoundly, the human costs.
Yeah, the human side is just immense.
Our goal really is to try and pull out the core insights from these sources and help you understand the deeper implications, for the region and maybe even beyond.
And we've got some really solid sources to work with here. There's Bilal Pandow's Economics of Kashmir Conflict.
That's key for the economic angle.
Yeah. Then there's that detailed data on fatalities from terrorist violence. Goes from 88 to 2019.
Really sobering numbers in there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Plus, we have reporting from Al Jazeera. The Economic Times gives us that immediate context.
Right, the ground level view.
And then broader analysis from the Council on Foreign Relations, the Lowy Institute.
Offering those strategic perspectives, yeah.
And finally, that Kashmir, the clash of identities analysis from Beyond Intractability, that gives us the historical and political background.
So if we start trying to, connect the dots across all of this, what becomes pretty clear, I think, is that we're not just looking at separate acts of violence. It's a multifaceted challenge. You've got these tangible economic consequences, devastating human loss, and these persistent underlying political and social drivers.
They're all tangled together.
Exactly. They're all interwoven.
So where should we start? Maybe with something that isn't always the first thing people think of with conflict. The economic toll.
I think that makes sense. Pandow's research really drives home just how significant the economic damage has been.
It's not just a general feeling of disruption, is it? He puts numbers on it.
He absolutely does. And what's particularly striking isn't just, some disruption. It's the specific substantial losses he quantifies. He estimates a loss of 17,878 crore Indian rupees after Article 370 was abrogated in August 2019.
17,000 crore. Wow. That's huge.
It is. And it's not just a blip, right? It represents a real fundamental setback for the region's economy. So Pandow's work, it shows this kind of systematic undermining of Kashmir's economic self-reliance.
Making it more vulnerable.
Yeah, and potentially, fueling more resentment down the line.
And it's not just these big policy moments either. It's the day-to-day stuff. Pandow talks about repeated shutdowns, curfews, protests, how they just constantly chip away at the economy.
He gives that example, doesn't he? 168 curfews in 9 districts.
In just 2016 and 2017 alone.
Imagine trying to run a business or just live your life. With that level of constant disruption, it's an enormous amount of lost productivity.
And then there was that communication blockade in 2019. How long is that?
214 days. Pandow really emphasizes the widespread business losses, the closures that came from that.
214 days with no proper communication.
When you sever communication lines for that long, it just ripples through everything. Small traders, bigger companies, everyone feels it.
It's hard to even really grasp the scale of that. And it's not like this is just academic analysis. You mentioned even official government reports kind of acknowledge this, right?
Yeah, they do. They admit to condensed per capita GDP growth, less foreign investment, lower exports, trade flow, all because of the conflict.
Didn't they put a number on the 2016 unrest?
They did, a loss of 16,000 crore just during that period of unrest in 2016.
So this sustained economic pressure. Does Pandow's research suggest, maybe, that this creates an environment where militant groups find it easier to get support?
That's a really crucial question. Protracted economic hardship, desperation, it can certainly make people more susceptible, more vulnerable to groups promising easy answers, however misguided those promises are.
It creates fertile ground, maybe?
Potentially. And it's also important to see that this economic vulnerability, it has history. Pandow touches on things like agreements between the Reserve Bank of India and the J&K government.
How did that work?
Well, basically, over time, these agreements subtly increase the region's economic dependence on New Delhi. Kashmir had less control over its own money, its own financial institutions.
So more reliant on Delhi's decisions.
Exactly, which further limited its own independent economic potential.
Okay, so that paints a clear and frankly pretty concerning picture of the economic damage.
Yeah.
Let's shift then to the human cost.
Yeah.
That data you shared on fatalities, 1988 to 2019, it really lays bare the tragedy.
It's deeply upsetting stuff. The overview is just stark. Between 88 and 2019, you're looking at 14,921 civilians killed.
14,000 civilians.
Plus 6,530 security force personnel. And 23,779 alleged terrorists.
So the total is over 45,000.
Over 45,000 lives lost directly to this violence. It's a number so big, it's hard to really comprehend the individual stories, the individual tragedies behind it.
45,000. Just staggering. And when you look at the yearly breakdown of that data, you see these spikes, these really intense periods of violence.
Definitely. The early 1990s and then the early 2000s again, those are particularly grim years.
What was the peak year?
According to this data, the highest total fatalities were in 2001, a shocking 4,507 deaths in just that 1 year.
4,500 people. Looking at these trends, does the data suggest anything about maybe how the violence changed over time, like who was being targeted?
That's a really key observation. If you focus just on the civilian deaths, the data does show a decrease in the later years compared to the absolutely horrific numbers in the 90s.
Right, like 1993 had over 1,000 civilian deaths.
0.1996 had over 1,300. Even 2001 still saw over 1,000 civilians killed. It paints this awful picture of ordinary people just caught in the middle.
But as you said, the recent Pahalgam attack shows civilians are still very much targets.
Exactly. So while the overall intensity might have fluctuated, the risk to civilian life, that remains a deeply concerning constant. It hasn't gone away.
No, clearly not. And when you look back at the 90s, those numbers are just horrifying. Then you see Pahalgam, and it feels like this awful echo, this pattern of militants deliberately targeting civilians.
The Economic Times report really underscores that pattern, doesn't it? It lists some of those major attacks on civilians just since 2000.
Yeah, the Chattasinghpura massacre, 36 Sikhs killed.
The Nunwan base camp attack in 2000, 32 pilgrims.
The J&K legislature complex in 2001, 36 killed there.
Nadi Marg in 2003, 24 Kashmiri Pandits.
And the Amarnath Yatra bus attack, more recently, in 2017, 8 pilgrims.
It's just a grim, grim list, and it really highlights how vulnerable civilians have been and continue to be.
It's devastating just thinking about the individual lives behind those numbers.
It truly is. Each one isn't just a statistic. It's a family shattered, a community scarred. So, okay, we have this picture of economic devastation and this tragic human cost.
Yeah.
But to really get why this cycle keeps going, we need to dig into the roots, right? The fundamentals.
And that's where the clash of identities analysis comes in.
Exactly. That piece from Beyond Intractability provides really crucial context here. It explains that Kashmir isn't just one single problem.
Right. It's kind of layered.
It's layered. It's an internal struggle, Kashmiris wanting autonomy or independence, but it's also an interstate dispute between India and Pakistan, both claiming the whole territory.
And that dual nature makes it incredibly hard to solve.
Hugely challenging. They trace the start of the sort of modern insurgency back to 1988.
With the JKLF initially.
Right. But then there's the whole question of the Indian government's response, like imposing direct rule in the 90s. Some would argue that was necessary, right? A security response.
Sure, that's one perspective. How does the clash of identities analysis handle that?
Well, it suggests that while Delhi saw direct rule as necessary to counter the insurgency and restore order, its implementation maybe had unintended consequences.
Like what?
Like the collapse of civil administration that went with it. That likely worsened the sense of alienation, of disempowerment among Kashmiris.
So it potentially pushed more people towards militancy because they felt they had no other way.
That's the argument. They felt they had no other avenue for expressing political views or grievances. And the nature of the militant groups also changed around then. After a ceasefire in '94, you saw more Islamist-oriented groups emerging.
With different goals, maybe different tactics than the earlier JKLF.
Often, yes.
And the history just keeps piling up, doesn't it? Multiple wars between India and Pakistan.
1947, 1965, 1971.
Kargil in 1999.
Right. And that unresolved UN resolution promising a plebiscite, a vote that never actually happened.
It feels like this huge weight of unresolved history just hanging over everything.
Absolutely. The analysis really emphasizes these deep historical roots, goes all the way back to British colonialism, their divide and rule policies.
Which didn't exactly help religious tension.
No. And then you have the accession itself, hugely contentious. A Hindu ruler deciding to join India, despite the Muslim majority population. That's a core point of disagreement right from the very beginning.
And it seems like whatever autonomy Kashmir was initially promised, it got chipped away over time.
That's a major point in the analysis. The removal of the Prime Minister of Kashmir back in 1953, the gradual watering down of Article 370 over decades.
That must have created huge resentment, a sense of betrayal.
Precisely. The feeling was that the initial promise of some self-governance within India was fading, replaced by increasing control from the center. Many Kashmiris saw it as a breach of the original agreement.
A major source of discontent.
Definitely. And then layered on top, you have these fundamentally different narratives. Pakistan believing Muslims are oppressed under Indian rule.
Versus India emphasizing its secularism and Kashmir being an integral part.
Right. Two totally opposed views. And even within Kashmir, as the analysis points out, it's not monolithic. You've got pro-India factions, pro-Pakistan factions, and a big segment wanting complete independence.
Such a complex web of identities and aspirations.
Which brings us nicely to the international angle and the, frankly, serious security implications. The Council on Foreign Relations analysis really underscores this. Kashmir isn't just a local issue.
No, it affects stability across South Asia, and because both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons.
It immediately becomes a global security concern. The stakes are incredibly high.
Exactly.
And the CFR analysis makes another interesting point, that Pakistan's focus on Kashmir arguably pulls its security forces' attention away from dealing with militants inside its own borders.
That's an interesting perspective. And then there are the constant accusations flying back and forth. India blaming Pakistan's ISI for supporting militants.
Which Pakistan always denies. It just keeps ratcheting up the tension.
And those peace processes that seem to start and stop.
Yeah, they always seem to get derailed, don't they? Political crises or, tragically, another terrorist attack happens.
So what does CFR suggest? Direct U.S. mediation?
Actually, no. Their experts seem to think that direct U.S. involvement on the core Kashmir issue itself might be counterproductive, given how sensitive it is for both sides.
How so?
They argue for focusing more broadly, trying to foster a general rapprochement, a better relationship between India and Pakistan. They see that as a more effective long-term path to fighting terrorism and getting regional stability.
Makes sense. Tackling the symptoms versus the underlying condition.
Kind of. And they also raise that chilling prospect of, future large-scale attacks like Mumbai.
And the risk of Indian retaliation. It highlights just how precarious things are.
Very precarious. Now, the Lowy Institute analysis gives us another angle, specifically on the recent Pahalgam attack, thinking about the strategic goals behind it.
Going beyond just causing casualties.
Exactly. What's really insightful in their assessment is the idea that this attack was likely timed and planned to undermine the Indian government's narrative.
The narrative of normalcy and progress in Kashmir since Article 370 was removed.
Precisely. Especially undermining that narrative on the international stage, they also suggest a deliberate aim to try and reverse any economic or social gains that might have been made since 2019.
And maybe even worse, to try and provoke a strong reaction from India.
Yes. Perhaps even a military response, because that would automatically put Kashmir back on the international agenda.
At a time when India's been trying very hard to frame it as purely an internal matter.
Exactly. The Lowy Institute also points out the timing coinciding with the U.S. Vice President's visit.
Is there a history there?
Disturbingly, yes. They draw a parallel to an attack just before President Clinton visited back in 2000. It suggests a calculated move to grab maximum international attention right at a diplomatically sensitive time.
Wow. And the wider international picture is shifting too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Lowy mentions Pakistan's relationship with Saudi Arabia may be weakening.
Yeah, and the relatively quiet reaction from Gulf states when Article 370 was revoked, it suggests the global and regional view on Kashmir might be changing, or at least becoming more complex.
So this puts the Indian government in a tough spot.
A real dilemma, as Lowy points out. There's huge domestic pressure in India to respond forcefully, especially after civilian deaths. People want reassurance. But any big reaction risks playing right into the militant strategy, raising the international profile of Kashmir, which is exactly what Delhi wants to avoid.
It's a very, very delicate balancing act. Huge domestic and international risks either way.
Absolutely.
Okay, finally, looking ahead. That source, the future of Kashmir struggle and Indian obstinacy. It stresses the need for realism, right? moving beyond just emotion.
Yes, it emphasizes pragmatic solutions, not just ideological stances. It also brings up some historical grievances from within Indian-administered Kashmir, like accounts of oppressive rule under past administrations.
So what's the main takeaway there?
I think what's most relevant for our discussion is its call for a more impactful way forward for the Kashmiri struggle itself. It suggests shifting towards strategies that might actually yield tangible results.
Moving beyond sentiment towards concrete actions?
Something like that. Addressing the underlying issues with actionable steps.
Okay. So as we try and pull all these threads together, it's a really sobering, really complex picture that emerges.
It really is.
You've got Pandow's research showing clear, significant economic damage from the conflict. You've got the stark fatalities data, the grim list of attacks from the Economic Times, underscoring that tragic ongoing human cost.
Devastating.
And then all the sources, but especially that clash of identities piece, they just illuminate how deep these historical, political, and international roots go, how entrenched it all is.
And it's vital for you listening to understand this isn't simple. There are no easy answers here. These different sources we've looked at, they paint a picture of a conflict that's protracted, deeply rooted, with consequences that stretch far and wide.
Multiple layers of history, competing politics, geopolitics.
All tangled together.
And you just can't ignore the human impact at the center of it all, the suffering, the economic hardship. It's profound. And it really underscores how urgently a just, lasting resolution is needed. One that actually addresses everyone's legitimate concerns.
This whole deep dive, it really highlights this cycle of violence, doesn't it? And how interconnected security is across the region. So maybe the final thought for you to mull over is this.
Yeah.
Given everything we've discussed, the economic realities, the human tragedies, the history, the international pressures, what do you think are the most critical factors? What could genuinely change the direction here, move things towards a more peaceful, stable future for Kashmir and for the whole region?
A lot to think about.
Maybe exploring that way forward suggested in the last article we mentioned. Perhaps that offers some starting points for your own reflection.